Why do we ask questions? We are an imaginative species. As our imagination grows, so do our questions. The more answers we find to these questions and the more difficult we make these questions, the more complicated we make these questions, we enhance our possibility to evolve. Welcome to the land of Bharat. My name is Vivek Ram, and I am the Senapati of Vanar Sena Studios. At Vanar Sena Studios, we like to talk about ancient Indian stories. We like to raise questions. It's always not on the surface, but these questions are hidden in the stories that we try to tell. What are ancient Indian stories? These stories, if you've grown up in India, are something that you've heard from your parents, your grandparents, your friends, your family. You've very rarely escaped hearing at least a few of these stories. But have they been explained to you? They probably have been explained in its own way. But in recent India, asking questions is not something that is encouraged. People ask you not to ask questions and just follow. This is what it is. This is how it's always been. Please follow. The ancient Indian would disagree with you, would disagree with us. The ancient Indian enjoyed questions. If you look at the Upanishads, for that matter, it's a complete Q&A. If you look at a lot of characters in many books, they're always raising questions, no matter who's standing in front of them, even the so-called gods. For that matter, the most popular book that we have, the Bhagavad Gita, is a Q&A between Arjuna and Krishna. And Arjuna is not satisfied with all the answers, so he goes on, and Krishna patiently answers each and every question of his. In today's talk, we're hoping that we can raise some similar questions from very popular stories. So with the possibility that you might go home or go away from this talk with questions and with the hope of finding those answers. This will probably enhance the way we all live, not just as individuals, but as a society. So what are these Indian stories? Largely, we have Indian scriptures categorized into ancient Indian scriptures, categorized into Vedas, Upanishads, Itihasas, Puranas. Now, the Vedas are largely poems and parts of ritualistic structure. They might be in praise. The stories are smattered in them. You do not have linear storytelling in most of the Vedas. Whereas if you look at the Upanishads, it's mostly Q&A. There are some stories told here and there based on the questions. But the Itihasas and the Puranas have a lot of stories. Let's start with the most popular one that we have, the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata, as we're all aware of, many of us are, I'm hoping, is the story of the Pandavas versus the Kauravas. This is what we're all largely told. Through social media, through television, through all kinds of literature, we are told that the Pandavas were the good guys, the Kauravas were the bad guys. They fought, and then, of course, the Pandavas won. And we are told that this is good, this is bad. I would choose to disagree at this point. The Mahabharata and the Pandavas and Kauravas episode is not a question of good and bad. Indian stories largely talk about action and consequence. There is some kind of action and then there is some kind of consequence. It's not whether this is good or whether this is bad. There are multiple stories where you think what is done is right, and then there's a consequence that confuses you. And this is the entirety of the Mahabharata, the entirety of all the ancient Indian stories. Let's look at the base situation that the Mahabharata is in. Very briefly, the Kauravas and the Pandavas lived in the same house. Dhritarashtra and Pandu were brothers. Dhritarashtra was born blind. Pandu became king. Pandu had an illness, had to leave, and Dhritarashtra became king. Not prince regent, not a placeholder king, but a king. Pandu, of course, had children away from the palace. Then the children came back to the palace. Whereas Dhritarashtra had children in the palace. Now, of course, when the children grew up together for a certain period of time. As the children grew up, some points of jealousy kicked in. The Pandavas decided they wanted a share of the kingdom. They wanted to be king because Yudhishthir was the oldest. Duryodhan decided, and this was on the Kaurava side, the Duryodhan decided that he wanted to be king because his father was king, rightfully so. And of course, they had a conflict because of this. Many episodes in where you can figure out who was right, who was wrong. The Pandavas were given a kingdom, the Pandavas lost the kingdom. Questions were raised, questions were answered. Now let's look at the larger questions in the story. We all tend to believe the Pandavas were right and the Kauravas were wrong. Were they really? First question that I'm going to put out there. Let's assume you were living in a house. Your father owned the house. Cousins came over. Cousins grew up with you. Now cousins laid claim to the house. Would you like it? Is this fair? If you fought and you lost, are you the evil person in question? Let's assume that you understood that the cousins that want your house are much stronger and will create a fight, a war. You just might lose, or in the battle, you might lose a lot of your family. How much are you willing to give away for peace? Now, in the story, we hear that the Pandavas said, fine, we will go away without war, give us 5 villages. And Duryodhana says, no. Let's jump straight to the end of the war. The Pandavas fought the Kauravas, the Pandavas won. What popular media fails to tell you is that when that war was over, a handful of people were alive. Krishna and the 5 Pandavas, Kritavarma and Kripa. Drona was dead, Bhishma was dead, Duryodhana was dead, Abhimanyu was dead, the children of the Pandavas were dead, the children of the Kauravas were dead, the women were alive, crying. When the Pandavas walked into the palace after claiming victory, they walked into a ghost palace. Their friends and family were not around. Their people that they loved, people that they grew up with were not around. They were all dead in the war. Is this really victory? As we ponder on answers, and of course possibly more questions from the Mahabharata, let's move on to another story. Let's move on to my favorite Itihasa, the Ramayana. Now the Ramayana, as we're all aware of, is Rama and Sita's love story. Ravana kidnaps Sita, Rama goes and rescues Sita, and of course they get back together. Now there's a very interesting episode that happens right at the end of the war. We won't get into the larger questions in the epic. We'll just look at the end. It's a very controversial end. Sita is rescued by Ram. Rama receives Sita at the outskirts of Lanka because he can't go into the city. As soon as Sita is out, till now, all the way through the story, you've seen Rama in love. You've seen Rama crying for Sita. You've seen Rama pining for Sita. You've seen Sita crying for Rama. At the end of the war, Rama knows that he's going to become king again. Sita knows that she's going to be queen. This is a very interesting situation. So as soon as Sita is out of the palace and Sita is in front of Ram, Ram turns away, very cold, and tells Sita, please pick another husband from this audience. I cannot take you back as queen. I cannot take you back as my wife. Why does he do this? It's an interesting little footnote on the side that says the law of the land at that point said that a woman who's lived in another man's house cannot be accepted back as wife. This is the law of the land. This is not made by Ram. This is made by the people. We can judge that law, but we are in no position to do it. We are centuries ahead and society has changed. But let's look at the law from that perspective. What are the questions we see? Of course, a lot of the current audience blames Rama, calls him a bigot, calls him a patriarch, feels sorry for Sita. But let's look at the questions. Let's leave our emotions aside. We live in a society today. We have leaders, we have ministers, we have presidents. Would you prefer that the prime minister or the president of your land changes law for their convenience? Would you prefer, if a crime has been committed and the crime is relative, let's not say that Sita has committed a crime, but from the law of the land's perspective, there is a guilty party. If a crime is committed by the prime minister or the president or their family, should the law change to benefit them? As citizens, would you like it? As citizens, would you appreciate a leader who changes for their convenience? Is the law made by the people or is the law made by the king? In this context, it is very clear the law was made by the people. The king was the upholder of the law. What is law in this regard? It is subjective because law changes over centuries, over time. Now, here is a king who understands that he needs to go back to the palace and become king and stand as an example to his citizens. Should he change the law? Let's not answer that question just yet. Sita understood this. Sita understood that Ram had a dilemma, a legal dilemma. In the texts, we are all constantly aware that Sita is much more honed and has more expertise in statescraft than Ram does. Every argument between Ram and Sita, Sita wins. So she finds a loophole in this situation. So Sita does something very interesting here. Sita is, of course, not going to back down. Sita is not going to take it and say, oh, this is what the law is. Sita is extremely intelligent. Of course, she's shocked. She cries. She complains. But there's a little loophole in this law. Contrary to popular belief, especially in the country, Ram does not ask Sita to go for a fire test or a test by fire. Sita suggests this, and she does not call it a test. She asks Lakshman to gather wood so that she can immolate herself in the fire. Now, this woman who is strong of faith, strong of discipline, strong of character, walks into this burning flame and then walks out. What has she done here? She has proven that there is a universal law that is higher than social law. And if you think this is fantasy, I would recommend that all of you Google the burning monk. I'm not going to get into the details of this, but in Indian systems, it has been very clearly aware for a very long time that if you have a certain sense of discipline and if you have a certain sense of character and you're mentally of a certain composition, of course, there are words for this that I'm not using at this point, then fire will not harm you immediately. This is something Sita is aware of. So the question is, as queen or as to be queen, does she change the law or does she rebut the law? Now, should she have stood her ground? Interesting question. Did she? Did she prove the man wrong? Did she prove society wrong? So Sita clearly knew law, but she also understood universal law. She also understood what breaks social law. Makes us wonder, what is law? What do we follow these days? Do we follow social law? Do we follow universal law? How does one understand or find universal law? While we think about this again, I'm going to close today's talk with a very interesting story. It's a story we've all heard about in India. There are probably very few people in the country right now who've not heard about this story. But for the ones who haven't, allow me to take another 5 minutes of your time while I explain the story of Ganesha. Parvati fell in love with Shiva. Parvati decided to woo Shiva. Through her devotion, she woos Shiva. Shiva falls in love with Parvati. They get married. Shiva, of course, is in meditation most of the time or with his ganas, his people, and spends time with Parvati. Parvati leaves her family, leaves her home to be with Shiva on an icy mountain. And so as the story goes. She does not have the people that Shiva has. She only has Shiva. So there are times when he's not available. There are times when she's wondering what to do. So during one of these episodes, Parvati decides to create a child. It is not natural birth, as we know of it. She gathers the clay around her bathing area, forms a child from the soil, breathes life into it, and a boy is born. This boy, of course, loves his mother, adores her, she adores him. They form a bond of mother and child, which is beautiful. And they spend time together. Shiva, of course, comes back one of these days from his meditation or from his conversations, he comes back to see his wife. When he approaches their home, he sees this boy on the way. The boy, of course, sees a stranger, so the boy stops Shiva. Shiva refuses to be stopped, and he's known for his anger. So, in his anger, a conflict ensues. Shiva and this boy fight. There are more people of Shiva who fight this boy. The boy seems quite formidable, but ultimately Shiva wins. Shiva cuts off the boy's head and very victoriously goes towards Parvati. Parvati hears of the death of her child and is distraught. She is angry, she is sad, she is in loss, she doesn't know what to do, and there are forms of anger that erupt from her. Of course, Shiva realizes something is wrong. Shiva finds out that this was Parvati's child. So, to appease her, an elephant is found. It was supposed to, there's more to the story, which I'm not getting into. But an elephant is found, the elephant's head is severed and placed on this boy's head, and thus is born Ganesha. Let me leave you today, in today's talk, with a few questions. Why did Parvati create this child? Was Parvati lonely? Could she have spoken to someone? Could Shiva have checked? What does this tell us about Parvati and Shiva's relationship? Could communication have solved this problem? Could communication have avoided the birth of this child? Could communication have avoided the trauma that they went through when the child's head was severed? And of course, my last and most interesting question for me: is trauma absolute? Or do we always have a resolution that we can work towards? Thank you very much for listening to me. My name is Vivek Ram, and it has been a pleasure.